Is it true that TED6969.com is live?
Might be.
The redirect of twogirlsonecup.com.
Is it true that TED6969.com?
Don't start that. Might be.
There we go.
Redirect to twogirlsonecup.
Yeah, that's in there now. Okay, let me say hello. Thank you, everyone. Sorry for Clint's addition there. Do not investigate that any further. Do not. All right, moving on.
You just created a whole bunch of curiosities.
Don't do it, people. It's gross. Don't do it. Couldn't have said it. Don't do it. All right. You've been warned. And so this show, Google has done a lot and said a lot in the month of November. And so I just want to kind of objectively look at the things they've said and done in the month of November. There's one exception. I also mentioned Core Web Vitals on a slide. So that happened before November, but most of this show is about November. So with that, I want to briefly mention Carolyn's podcast, because she had a survey, and I'm hoping that she'll tease some of the answers she's gotten in her survey. So Carolyn, what's going on with that?
Well, if you want to hear, listen to last week's episode. Yeah, I did kind of share some of the top responses. So it was fun. Yeah, so we're heading back into, I guess, the last three or four episodes. So I might talking about backlinks this week. I don't know.
Very cool. And your podcast, again, is on just about every platform. So people can find it anywhere, including Google. You can search for it by name. I have the bit.ly link here. So check it out. It's getting more and more popular. How many countries are your viewers in now? You had a big number.
It's a big number. It's like 67.
Yeah, so that's awesome.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you want tips on starting a podcast, Carolyn is definitely the person to ask. And check out this podcast. I love it. I listen to all the episodes.
Thank you.
So diving right in. So the big headlines, in November, early December were these months. We had around November 4th, they said a spam update was rolling out. On the 17th, they said it was a core update. Then at the end of November, they said the core update finished. And then a day later or so, they said the product reviews update was rolling out. And so that's kind of a lot to unpack within 1 month. So it had a spam update, core update, product reviews update, bam, bam, bam. Just these are, bigger events, and they packed them back to back. And so that really complicates how we try to understand these events. So if we look at them individually, it's a little complicated. So for example, we have the spam update, and it was announced over here, but clearly from the data, it started, 3 days prior. So they announced it after it was already underway. If we look at the core update, again, they announced it over here, but clearly it started a few days prior. So it's when they announce and when the volatility kicks in, those things aren't lining up. It's not like they announce and then things start happening. That's not the way it's working out. When they announced the ending, that's another interesting type of announcement they do. They announced that it was done, way over here. But when you look at the activity, this activity doesn't look done. And so that's, really confusing to understand why they'd say it's done when everything is still in turmoil. And it could be that we, might have had a day or two of return to baseline, back here on November 22nd, 23rd. So maybe it ended here and got announced there. Or maybe they consider this 29th, you could probably argue that looks, other than local SEO, that looks like kind of a return to baseline. So we had a baseline over here at the start of the month. And what we generally hope is that we see everything get active like this and then a return to a new baseline at the end. And so what might have happened is we also have this product review update. It was announced right here. But again, clearly it probably started before the announcement date. So we might have a case where the core update was in decline, but there's update overlap and the product review update is on the rise. And so this, end of the core update really isn't observable because the two were overlapping. And so it gets really complicated. And as an SEO, what we tend to want to see is a start from, a baseline condition, and then a return to like a new normal or a similar baseline condition. And we haven't seen that new normal or return to baseline really. There's like a day in there that could arguably be a return to baseline. But a day is not enough to really call it or do any analysis. So things just kind of kicked up and stayed kicked up, and we're still waiting. And I still think this isn't going to end until mid to late December. So the question becomes, how do we view something like this where Google is calling it many things? And there are generally two schools, and my favorite one is I view it all as one event. It might address multiple things, but to me as an SEO on the outside, it's one event. We had a baseline, we had a bunch of volatility. When it returns to some kind of a baseline, I'll call the event over. And I'll see how things looked before the event, and I'll compare it to how things look after the event. And it's totally fine to think, well, the event covered topics A, B, and C. That's okay. It's an A and B and C event. But a lot of people say, no, you have to look at it the way Google called it. It was A, then B, then C. But dicing it up into phases like that, it doesn't really change anything. You still have to wait for it to end and see where the chips fall. And so at the end of the day, from our perspective as SEOs, we still got to treat it all as, one big update that covered A, B, and C. What do you think, Lee?
I think it's interesting in terms of how do we look at this. I'll go back to something that John Mueller says, and I hate quoting that, but Google does something on the order of like 3,600 little updates a year. And so if we look at the ones that they announce, which is, 1 or 2 a month, you're looking about, 20 that they give names to. And, the rest is just a constant state of flux hitting, a number of different sites. So other than, maybe a core update, which really causes, a lot of fluctuation over a few days, I don't know that we ever really return to any sort of baseline, because the baseline is always chaotic, you know?
Well, I definitely see stretches of days where there are baseline volatility. And
Right.
so you're right that, there's kind of this constant amount of churn, but there's also, some degree of baseline where, the things they're doing aren't massive, they're minor.
Right. But if you look at like a spam update, how many sites will that hit? It depends on the way that they're implementing it. If you look at a product review update, that's not going to affect local sites. Theoretically, it's not going to affect, informational sites. It's going to, affect, more product, the product review, which is going to be some smaller proportion of the total. So that, the overall impact that we see, in these fluctuation tools should be a little bit lower. It's an interesting thing trying to figure out in those circumstances where you have some things which impact 90% of the sites and some which impact 5% of the sites, where it ends and where it begins. So that, I agree with you, it's a challenge to figure that out.
So, Glenn, you do update analysis. What are your thoughts?
Well, I kind of liken this back to your episode you did on create our different versions of an update. I mean, you have what is ranking versus the HTML stuff. And honestly, I don't think that these other tools that are putting out these weather reports have even considered adapting to the HTML changes. And I can see that in my rank trackers. I mean, I use 4 different rank trackers on the same 4 set of keywords, and they're all different. And I charge that to the HTML changes that, I mean, you pointed out, and you can see that regardless if you're using extensions or whatever, you can see that there's definitely been changes in the way the code is there on the SERP pages. So how much of that bounce is HTML changes and the services haven't adapted to it yet? How much is it the search results have changed? How much is it that the types of keywords that they're using are different?
Yeah, I mean, totally. There are different types of updates, and those HTML updates where Google changes the search result presentation can break all of the weather systems that we're monitoring. So
Yeah. So I mean, it could be that you're already at a baseline, but none of those services have adapted to the new HTML. I mean, that's a could be. Corey, you're pretty good at picking that up, because as we're running them, if we see something weird, we'll let you know, and then you'll address to it, the HTML stuff. But I severely doubt. I mean, SEO Power Suite, I use their rank tracker. It's probably one of the better rank trackers. And when Google announces an update, I know for at least a week my rank tracking is going to be jacked up, because that's how long it takes them to adapt. So, and my guess is that these services are probably in the same boat, if not longer.
yep, there are complicating factors for sure. When you
Hey, hold on a second, Clint, have you thought about doing like an SEO Fight Club episode on that? I mean, because that's interesting to see, which, how updates and, changes in the HTML presentation, breaks the different rank trackers there. If that was coupled with some, SEO volatility tool looks at to see, what kind of volatility you're seeing in the moment versus what the rank trackers are showing. I mean, that would be really, really cool, I think.
I mean, it's so hard because all rank trackers suck. And it's not their fault. It's proximity, IPs, everything. You throw that all together, and rank trackers are they just suck. They're great at giving you kind of an average. I kind of liken them to Search Console, for example, where you get this position average, and they try to do a decent job. But again, with the HTML updates and stuff like that, and Ted's covered all this stuff like nauseum. I want to say it's probably been almost a year now since you've talked about it, Ted, but I've been using that as a philosophy in regarding to updates and changes and the reporting of the updates ever since. I just don't see that these people are as responsive as they need to be. And I doubt, I don't know. I'm going to go on a limb and say that I doubt that anyone's actually going in every once in a while and checking on the keyword set that they're using for this and making sure that your tools are reporting properly, etc. I think it's probably just something they set up. Oh, it's still spitting out a graph, so it must be working. It would be kind of my guess.
Yeah, and to some degree, there's a bit of trustworthiness in the data, but you're right that there are critical flaws. The reason I track multiple services is I like to see when they move in concert. And so when I see them all move together, I think that there's a signal of some sort. But you're right, when things go to baseline, that could be them all breaking together. But usually that breakage is everything plummets. And then when there is breakage, what you often see will be them correcting at different times, and so their graphs will stair step back up to where they should be. But you're right, there are fundamental flaws, but I think there are some clues, and the things that I find most trustworthy is when they all swoop up together, that they're seeing something. Now, what that is and how impactful it is to you and your keywords, that's all very subjective and opinionated. But what we're starting to see is that, kind of the new thing in terms of identifying when Google's up to something is what's going on with indexing. And so I'm really excited to see like the new techniques and the new tools that are emerging where people are detecting Google's indexing behaviors and reporting on that. Because more than ranking volatility, these fluctuations that these other weather tools are doing, when Google suspends indexing, like that's immediately useful information. Holy crap, they're doing something. Brace for it. Expect the content you're writing now not to perform quickly, because it probably won't. Understanding those nuances are really important, and especially with like rendered indexing, where even this year I've seen SEOs just on the brink of getting fired because Google stopped doing rendered indexing for a while, and those JavaScript framework online stores appear to have no content when that happens, and all their rankings tank at the same time, and the developers blame the SEO, and the CEO comes wagging a finger in the SEO's face saying, "What the hell did you do?" But it was Google. It wasn't the SEO at all. Google turned off the rendered indexing, and your choice to use JavaScript frameworks might have been a flawed choice. And with the amount of these big updates where Google does suspend and slow that type of indexing, if you go that path of using JavaScript frameworks and you don't account for Google's rendered indexing being offline and doing things like server-side rendering, you might find that your SEO is offline 25% of the year. There's 3 or 4 of these big updates every year. And if they take a month, that's a quarter of your year, your SEO is offline. But, going on too far on that topic. So with these, I kind of like to view them all as one big event. I don't see much value. Like, I like that Google drops hints as to what's in the event. So we know that, yeah, there is a spam update, there is a core update, and there is a product review update. I love that they drop those clues, but I still consider it one big event. Because typically the indexing doesn't return to normal until this returns to baseline. Things stay kind of wonky and unpredictable until we get back to a new normal. And that's another reason why I'm more interested in indexing behaviors, because those might be a better signal. Carolyn, what do you think about indexing behaviors?
Oh my God. Yeah, I mean, that's where I'm living most of the day, is seeing, and I see a huge drop off in just arrival. And I know a lot of what I'm looking at is, in particular, like I'm doing a daily experiment on one site, but I have access to so many others, and I'm looking in those server logs. And it's, some days, and I notice a difference between when they come for new content versus when they come for existing content. They come a lot more for existing content than new content.
Yeah, there seems to be two pipelines.
Yeah, and they call it discovery and refresh. And the refresh is usually about 75% of the time they come, and discovery is 25.
Yep. And I've seen at times where it really looked like they can suspend one but keep the other going. Like, I've seen times where I couldn't get new pages crawled and indexed, but other people with existing pages are saying, no, SEO is working fine for me.
I know.
And so you get those conflicts out in the chat groups where people are saying, SEO is totally broken, and somebody else is saying it's working great for me.
Yeah,
And it's different pipelines.
but a lot of times is people say they just published, but when you start talking with them and you find out all the other things that they did, like, oh yeah, I put it in the nav, and I'm like, wait a minute. It is so different than just publishing a brand new page. So it's just sometimes knowing what you're doing, and I'm starting to, like, I keep a change log just to make sure, like, if I'm trying something out, to note it, because it might be a difference, might make a difference.
Yep. And the thing I've really come to realize in the past year or two is that when people make conflicting claims of indexing isn't working and the other person says indexing is working fine, both can be right depending upon the situation. It is entirely possible that both are true.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, we should probably go deeper on that in a different show. So yeah, so with these updates, that's a whole thing that requires its own analysis, and I like to simplify it. I think when you get into the A, then B, then C, and you try to really identify when each phase of a large event happens, it gets really tricky and difficult to have any certainty. But when you look at these events as a baseline and then a return to a new normal baseline at some point, it really simplifies, and the work is still the same. You still, compare the SEO factors from before and the SEO factors from after and tease out the clues of how the world changed. But it just simplifies what you're looking for. The event is over when a baseline is returned to for, at least a few days. And so I think we'll probably see a return to baseline. My prediction hasn't changed at all. It'll be probably mid to late December when we get that return to baseline. And at that point, then I'll do the November update part 2, where I actually do the full formal analysis. I'm not doing it right now because it doesn't make sense to assess the damage while the earthquake is still happening. And so I like to wait for the earthquake to end, then we'll take a look. So another thing that's happened with communication out of Google is inconsistent claims of policy. So both of these were made in November, and they obviously had, more context than what I'm showing here. But you can see how you get very inconsistent message. So we have one here where John Mueller is saying you shouldn't be creating links to your site in general, which is very incendiary. And then later in the month, he's saying getting a link from a small or new site is fine, doesn't cause problems. And this is within the same month. This is all happening in November. And so there's very inconsistent claims of what the real policy is. Which one of these should you follow? And I tend to think for SEO in general, when you just take it out to SEO in general, that first claim of you shouldn't be building links is kind of full of crap. And I think the real truth of the matter for SEO in general is that second statement that he said. And you have to actually look at what he's saying and figure out, under which occasions is it kind of full of crap and you can ignore it and it's based on a specific someone and their situation versus broad sweeping general SEO policy. And if you're not going in with a fine-tooth comb and figuring that out, you're probably going to run off the rails. And I know Clint has had a lot of opinions about listening to Google. Clint, has your opinion on listening to Google changed at all lately?
No, it's pretty much the same. I ignore everything they say. I test things. I mean, there's probably some grains of truth in what their PR machine is putting out. And I understand John and the rest of those guys are really put in a shitty position, right? Because at the end of the day, they're not going to tell you how to rank, because if they do, it compromises the search engine. But I mean, in this case, you could play it on the devil's advocate side. You shouldn't be creating links, but if somebody with a brand new site links to you, then don't worry about it. Versus you shouldn't be creating brand new sites and then linking to your website. That might be bad. So you can play around with it and do some wordsmithing with that and reinterpret everything that he goes on here. And I think it's really because we all know that if he was specific and said specific things, that those methods would be exploited and ruined within 24 to 48 hours. And
Yeah.
It's just how we are. And it sucks for John because we get to talk crap about him and say how bad he is. But at the end of the day, I mean, I don't think that. I mean, we've had this discussion before, right? Where is he intentionally lying or is he being intentionally vague? And I think it probably is closer to he's being intentionally vague, or he just plain doesn't really know and then kind of has to guess based off of what's in the webmaster guidelines that I'm sure he's got memorized.
Yeah. I was surprised that he went on in this quote to say that building links is fine too.
Yeah.
That caught me off guard. The other thing is that the story evolves. And so this one didn't happen in November. This is the exception prior to November, but Core Web Vitals. So we had, way back that, user experience is going to become a Google ranking factor. And, expect, page experience next year. It's going to be a thing. And then Google says, well, it's going to be a small thing, kind of a tiebreaker. And then they come back and say, no, it's going to be more than a tiebreaker. And then they say, yeah, there's going to be positive effects when you fix your core web vitals. And then they come back and say, well, core web vitals is unlikely to be the primary ranking factor, implying that it will be a ranking factor. It just won't be the big one. And then they take that back again and they're going to say, well, it's going to have a tiny advantage. And then they come back and say, well, you don't actually need all the scores. And, through all this time since then, I've seen 4 independent core web vitals studies that were conducted independently, done using different methodologies. One was my own, which was private. One was Lee's, which was public. One was Clint's, which was public. And one was Derek Iwasiuk's, which was private. All 4 of those studies came to the exact same conclusion that core web vitals is garbage in terms of doing anything for SEO, and you're probably wasting your time and money addressing it. With the caveat that it's probably important in the most extreme cases. If you have the most abysmal website performance imaginable, it's probably going to matter to fix it. But if your website is anything close to typical, then focusing on these core web vitals is probably not going to do anything. Does that kind of summarize your thoughts on it, Clint?
Yeah, I think if like you said, if your site is horrible and then you fix it and go fast, you're going to see a ranking boost. But you would have seen that before core web vitals anyway. On the other side of it, I won't say ignore page speed optimization. And core web vitals will give you some things to address in the reporting. And that will help with conversions. So if you open your website on a mobile phone and it takes longer than 3 seconds, and you need to do some page speed stuff, but you don't need to be chasing these scores. You don't need to be living and dying by core vitals, page speed insights, the Chrome user experience report. You can ignore all that. In my opinion, and I said this during my Rockstars presentation as well, it's designed to reduce the cost of crawling the web. And the way that they got everyone to jump on board is they told SEOs, hey, it's going to be a ranking factor. So SEOs, ergo, went and spent the last year and a half telling every business owner that they could, that they should be paid some extra money to optimize for core web vitals because it's going to be a ranking factor. And there'll be the great mobile get-in. I don't know if you guys all remember that. That happened. That was kind of the same boat. HTTPS, that happened, same boat. And then core web vitals. So Google got SEOs 3 times and no one has called them out for it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you look at page speed in terms of maximizing organic traffic and maximizing conversion, I think you're going to look really good with the outcome of that project. I think if you look at page speed and core web vitals and you tell your employer or client that it's about rankings and we're going to do page speed improvement for rankings, I think you're going to look really bad at the end of that project. So if you understand what page speed is actually going to impact, there's a way to pitch it and look good, and there's a way to pitch it and look bad. And you really need to understand those dynamics before you pitch those kinds of projects. So another type of thing that we see coming out of communication from Google is when the information isn't quite right. And there's a number of reasons why the information might not be quite right coming from them. One of which is there may be a very specific context to which they're talking about, and it's only correct within that context. Another situation is they're telling you part of the story, but they're not telling you the whole story because, like Clint said, they can't. So it's partially, transparent. And then there are cases where it just appears to be flat out wrong. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, type of thing.
Can't believe you don't have passage indexing on this.
They didn't talk about it a lot in the headlines. So if it would have come up, but yeah, passage.
Because we don't index pages in parts, but that's exactly what passage indexing is.
But that story evolved. Like the last one, it started off as passage indexing, but then they came back and said, no, it's passage ranking. So they evolved that one. But where John Mueller here is saying we don't index pages in parts, well, there's a Google I/O presentation where they spelled it out. They said, hey, we have these two phases of indexing, one where we get the simple HTML of the page and we index that first. And then at a later time, we come back and render the page and all the scripts, and we re-index the page later based on that rendering. So that very much is literally indexing a page in parts and at different times. And we've also proven with SEO testing that there are parts of the page where keywords solely in those zones will not be indexed. So if you put a keyword in an HTML comment, Google used to index that keyword, used to be able to search for it and find it. But today you won't, because those HTML comments are now a no index zone. And so those represent parts of pages being indexed, not entire pages, because certain zones will not be indexed. So only parts of pages are being indexed. So there are two cases. And the thing about those two cases is that we can witness those ourselves. We can measure them. We can test them. Those are things we can see and measure with our own eyes. And because what we see and measure, reflects the reality of the SEO we do, that is a better source of information than just believing what we hear coming out of Google. And so a lot of people don't make that distinction that, hey, there are these techniques and things we do as SEOs that get us better information than what's coming out of Google. What do you think about that, Lee?
Yeah, I think it's confusing. That we don't index pages in parts. You cover it here well, but I do think passage indexing comes into this as well, because one is we don't index. Is that the verb, the process? Well, clearly Google's I/O does it in phases, so they do sort of the process in parts. Or are they talking about parts of a page where things will index? That's the the SEO testing part. Or are they talking about like passage indexing where we will index this paragraph off the page because it's particularly relevant, but the rest of the page is garbage, so it won't index. Are there paragraphs or fragments of a page that are there? It's unclear what it is that he's talking about, but clearly it's not, like you said, the information's not quite right, regardless of what he's picking.
Yep. And so, yeah, we have to, when we see these quotes, when we see these headlines, we really kind of have to go further than just surface level to try to figure this stuff out. So another problem is presentation bias. So we had this headline coming out of the blog. Semantic HTML is not a Google search quality signal. All right, that really gives an impression. But when you look at the quote in that article from John Mueller, but it definitely helps. So an equally valid, if not better, title characterizing the quote that John made could be Google semantic HTML definitely helps. So one is saying it's not a signal, and the other is saying it definitely helps. And what happened in this case is kind of like a junior SEO had an awkwardly phrased question where he kind of got too specific in the question, and John Mueller like honed in on the mistake and said, well, you know, that part isn't true, but it definitely is a signal. It's just not the signal category you thought it might have been. And the thing that the blog caught on to, again, was that mistake. They caught on to the awkwardly phrased question, and that became the headline. That semantic HTML is not a signal. Well, it is a signal. It's not a quality signal. But the mind-blowing thing here is that he said it, semantic HTML definitely helps. And as an SEO, that's the thing that I latch on to, because that's potentially a reveal. And so you got to look for that presentation bias, because if you're getting your SEO advice from the quotes and headlines, this headline would have left you with the feeling that semantic HTML is a nothing burger. But here is John Mueller saying it definitely helps. And the headline would have been a totally valid characterization to say Google semantic HTML definitely helps. What do you think, Clint?
Yeah, I would have used the latter one too. I think you probably would. Even from a publisher perspective, that one would have gotten way more traffic than the one that he did use. So he missed out on that one for sure.
Yeah, so you can't always believe the headline either, you know, and that's not Google's fault, but it's another layer of complexity to just kind of waiting for SEO knowledge to be served to you on a silver platter, which is kind of the problem. So as an SEO, you really need to stop waiting for everything to be handed to you. So as SEOs, we need to define and name noteworthy events. You know, we need to define and name things that we see and measure. We need to determine for our industry what is or isn't an effective ranking factor. You know, SEOs need to test and verify that their understandings are still true. And SEOs need to dig deeper than just the surface level of looking at the headlines. And the problem with just looking at the headlines is you're abdicating your understanding of SEO to blogs and Google. And you shouldn't do that. You should be in control of your understanding of SEO. Because when you leave it to the blog headlines and Google to tell you what is or isn't good SEO, it's just not going to end well. You know, any thoughts on that, Clint?
Yeah, I think we've kind of talked about that before, where it's trust everything, but test it as well, right? So trust everyone, test everything. So, and that's the same if you are following SEO blogs, whether it be SEO Fight Club, Carolyn's podcast, my shows, or Search Engine Land, Search Engine Journal. All of those, they all have a perspective and we all have personal opinions, and we inject our personal opinions into what we're telling you, and we're doing it from the best place. But at the end of the day, everything that I could say, or Ted could say, Carolyn could say, or Lee could say might not even apply to your market, and it could not even work, or it could be detrimental to your market. So trust everyone, test everything is kind of the philosophy I would kind of take this entire slide at and break down into something, one bullet point.
And the thing that kind of blows my mind with this presentation is that other than the slide about Core Web Vitals, all of these examples happened in November. Like, these problems aren't hard to find. They're common. I didn't dig up, a juicy one from 2 years ago. They all happened in November. And so you can expect these problems to happen again and kind of frequently. And so if you think that these are kind of rare fluke, cherry picked examples, well, they're kind of not. You can kind of expect a few of them to happen every month. Lee, you have any final thoughts?
No, I think that's perfect. Too often, we're looking for the shortcuts and things like that, and things continually move. So, if you're not testing, you're not analyzing it for yourself to see, where it may have been true last week is not true this week, then, it's a problem. That's why also, being part of organizations that do a lot of testing and things like that can be very, very valuable, because it keeps you like in the know about what's working today as opposed to what's in the headlines today.
Yep. So it looks like we might have a few comments over on YouTube. Paul L is asking, what are the Cora diff tools showing? I had a recent episode where I did that. I'm going to wait for a return to baseline on the volatility we're seeing. And then at that point, I'll do a full analysis. But my prediction I'm sticking to. So I said that we'd see this update, this major update activity settle down mid to late December. I still stand by that prediction. And so we're into December now, and it's still, pretty volatile. So once that settles down, then I'll do part 2 of the November core update analysis. So let's see, we have somebody saying we have been having these indexing issues, new URLs when we submit them are showing no data, not even discovered, not crawled, been a nightmare. Yeah, things get really hard during these major updates, and it will eventually self-correct. You just need to wait for these updates to end, and then normal Google processing will resume. So unfortunately, the only thing you can do is kind of wait. I like to think about areas where I can work and still make progress. So working on new content right now is great, but maybe don't aggressively try to get indexing until these updates are over. Let's see. Berkman says, same, my indexing of new pages has simply stopped. Like it's been shut off in Search Console. Yep, that's the signal. That's what we start to see now, is when something changes with the indexing behavior, we think that's the early sign that, oh, Google's up to something, everybody brace for it. And so, yeah, it's important to look at those indexing behaviors. Hayden says, I've been out of commission, missing SEO Fight Club, need to binge. Yeah, we've had a lot of amazing episodes. So yeah, check them out. Let's see. Dan says, I see people here are having indexing issues. Glad to see I'm not alone. Nothing is indexed for me the last few weeks. No new URLs. Hang in there. It always comes back. Like I often tell people, 9 times out of 10, the right thing to do is to wait. That doesn't mean you need to be idle. It just means if that page is tuned and ready for Google to reprocess, go work on a different page, go work on a different keyword. You know, you can still be productive and wait. Let's see. Jeff is saying struggling to get test pages indexed. Yeah, that's really common right now. See, Stefan says, surely though we can't all be expected to run tests continually, otherwise we wouldn't get anything done. At some point we have to choose who to trust. Yeah, that's true, but you know, ultimately I made my best money when I started testing. So when I started doing it for myself, things actually accelerated for me. So when I was in online retail, I had 15 stores. And so I brokered a deal with the owners that I could do any experiments I wanted to do on the poorest performing store. And then from there, any successes I had, I would replicate across all the other stores. And that way I was only replicating known successes across all the big money sites. And so even that small degree of SEO testing gave me the freedom to fail. For starters, not all my experiments on that tiny site worked out well, but I had a sandbox where I could fail without being fired. And because I could fail and have that freedom, I could learn faster. And because I was learning what works faster, I started making money. Took me less than a year to go from, you know, a peon in the company to director at the executive table to most highest paid employee commission base. You know, you can skyrocket with these principles. And so it's very easy to say, well, I can't spend all my time doing it. Well, I spent all my time doing it to great effect. So I think it's, you know, not necessary that you need to test, you know, do italic tags, you know, win all the time, but there is a role that testing can play that can accelerate your learning and help you be more successful in your career. Let's see, is there a WordPress theme that uses semantic HTML? They all do to a certain extent, but they all don't to a certain extent. When you look at people's headings and you see read more in an H3, you know, that's a fail. Your headings should be topically relevant to your content. And when they're not, you failed that. You know, the same way if you're going to use strong tags or EM tags or bold tags, they ought to be used on important words. And if you use them on unimportant things, then, you know, that's kind of a fail. Maybe you should have just styled a span tag instead. So it's more not that the theme uses them, it's more how you choose to use them. Let's see, Robert says, same here, atrocious indexing right now, even when we submit pages to Google Search Console. Terry Power says, that's the value of a testing group, learn from one another's testing and test things you know as well as things you don't know. Yeah. If you haven't joined an SEO community, and there's a lot of good ones out there, you know, there's not like one best one that's most important. SIA is great. IMG is great. Semantic Mastery is great. NFG is awesome. There's a lot of great groups out there. And if they do testing, they're even better. But just think about being in an SEO group and your ability to ask 200 SEO professionals, hey, I'm about to do this thing to my website. Is it a good idea? Just being able to ask that question to that group is like an amazing thing. And there are undoubtedly going to be SEO professionals in these groups who are doing testing. And those testers, they know things. And so, it's just, you'd be crazy to be an SEO and not be in one of the many awesome communities. What do you think, Clint? You run SIA. What's kind of the value proposition of the community portion?
I mean, I think the best thing out of them all is really the networking you get with new people and being able to reach out to them and talk to them and go bounce ideas off of. I mean, obviously, like most things, you can have a group with 200 people in it and maybe 12 are actually active in there and engaging, but still there's still the opportunities there for you. And that's kind of what I get out of them personally, and being able to also just follow along with conversations, maybe not even participate, just follow along and find the testing ideas, things to look at. So.
Yeah. I kind of view, having a community of SEOs as being the number one SEO tool. And like beyond that, you can get into, software and platforms and techniques and things of that nature. But for me, community is the number one SEO tool right after your brain. All right, Lee, final thoughts, and then we'll close this out.
Yeah, I think I've talked to people who wanted to get started in testing and so forth. And one of the things that doesn't occur to them instantly is that a lot of the testing can be like what you did when you were in e-com, which is you can test things that are very relevant to the problems that you're facing today and get an answer without having to reach out to everybody else. But being in a community where you've got people who are experts in different areas is definitely helpful. It's definitely a shortcut. But, bring something to the party too. Don't just show up to ask everybody everything without having something to offer yourself.
Yeah, and there's still a lot to offer, even if you're a beginner. The thing you ask and then return in a community is even an SEO beginner entry level is you say, what should I do in this situation? And then you say, thanks for that advice. I'll post how it works out. And you just share the result you get. And just that act of sharing is valuable to the whole community. But with that, we're going to call it here. I thank you again for joining us. Please remember to like and subscribe, because we live or die based on those subscription numbers. We actually only get maybe, $50, $100 a month in advertising revenue. So it really is a labor of love, and those subscription numbers unlock features in the platform. So please do remember. And I'm looking forward to announcing when SEO This Week is coming back. And apparently that'll be in January, most likely. Is that right, Clint? Oh, Clint is muted. He hinted that probably January.
Stupid hotkeys don't work. Yeah, it's January.
Awesome. So that's coming up, and we hope to share more on that topic next week. So thanks again, everyone. See you then.